Was it any evidence that was presented? Any, major analysis presented? No, it was
the
Eile raise.
Yeah. Hi everyone and welcome to Súil, a different view with me, Patricia Stevenson.
And I'm Rory Hearn.
And today we're going to talk about some of the biggest stories that we've seen in the week. And there's been, obviously, the biggest domestic story, Rory, has been around the rental changes, both the rental tenancy changes, so the changes to actual rent, but also short-term lets. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so this week we unfortunately saw the government introduce their rent hike bill, which was extremely frustrating. It was 5 hours of debate in the Dáil last night. We put through a lot of amendments, changes like, for example, a rent freeze and a ban on no-fault evictions, but the government just were not willing to listen. And there's been a lot of noise around this bill, and I think to explain to people kind of the most worrying aspect of it was that essentially when a tenant moves out, that what was the case up till the 1st of March, that there was still a 2% rent cap. The landlord couldn't hike up the rent when a tenant left, and they got it
an annual year.
Within a year, but at any point, exactly within the year. But now they'll be able to increase that rent to market rent. And so what you'll see is when you see that change, as it happens a lot with renters, the rents will go up. So it's really going to impact on people, who've been evicted, and there's, thousands of evictions. And as I highlighted before, and actually Una Mullally was writing in the Irish Times this week about that, we're now at the highest point of evictions since the famine, which is really just... And we
It's
have
terrifying.
them coming to us all the time,
We do, yeah. Everyone, like the biggest caseload probably across our desks is housing issues, people not finding somewhere to live. And there's such a trauma, I think, in the psyche, the Irish psyche. Like intergenerational trauma is real, and so that whole piece around, around the famine and the memory of that is actually passed down generation to generation. And that's why this is so appalling for so many people. And the government have this narrative that people within 6 years, if you're a tenant for 6 years, then your rent can't be increased. But that's not the reality of people's lives. Students move year after year. Yeah. 3.5 years, I think, is the average length of a tenancy. Yeah. So most people are moving after 3.5 years, which means their rent is going to be increased to market rent every single time.
And I was talking as well about this, that what's the market rent? Because it's a phrase just thrown around, and people go, well, you're looking daft now. The market rent is 3,000 a month, 3,500 a month. In Beaumont and Santry, for a 3-bedroom place, this is the rent been charged, or a 2-bedroom.
Rory, the government will tell you if you can't afford it, you can take out HAP.
You can take out HAP, and what is HAP? Of course, that's the housing assistance payment. That if you qualify for social housing, if your income is not above a certain threshold, you can get a support payment towards your rent. But the problem is they don't go near the actual rent. And there was a report out from the Simon communities this week which showed that there wasn't one property within the HAP limits in the entire country available. And HAP, as lots of people might know, was actually the main form of social housing that the government was providing for a long time. It wasn't building social housing. It moved away from it. And so they've created this mess. And the other big story this week was Airbnb and the short-term lets. And the government rolled back again.
And this bill, so the original bill around the changes to the short-term lets, we actually supported it because we thought that's great. They're going to make sure that more rental properties or properties to purchase are on the market. But what did the government do to change that overnight?
Overnight, they had promised last year that they would bring in legislation. Of course, they initially brought in legislation 3 or 4 years ago, which required planning, basically short-term lets to get planning, but it was never enforced. A tiny number of Airbnb short-term lets have planning. And then they said, okay, they introduced last year, we were going to bring in these measures and it'll apply to towns over 10,000 population. Now, I was actually critical last year of that. We were critical. We were saying actually it should be applied to everywhere, because, of course, one of the big communities, Gaeltacht areas, are, in rural areas, small population, are being devastated by short-term lets. And they changed and this week announced it's up to 20,000.
And why did they do that?
Well, that's the big question. Why was it any evidence that was presented? Any major analysis presented? No, it was the Eile raise.
Yeah, and it's so audacious. Like the fact that this is how power brokers are being worked to define policy that was going to affect so many people, Gaeltacht communities, rural communities across Ireland. it's awful. Like, people were hoping that this would bring a few more properties onto the market, and they will not be there.
And it's just incredible when you look at it. And this is, of course, this is the longer term impact of that government formation. The fact that the Lowry, the Healy-Rae independence, that this was the price of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael getting back into power again. That
I think that's such an important message for people.
that it is, that this is not evidence-based policy. This is parish pump politics. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael holding on to power, and this is one of the prices. So we don't have policy being made on the basis of housing need. We have it based on parish pump politics. And it's like Back to the Future in terms of that. And I know for a lot of people, and I've been in touch with the likes of Bonu, the Gaeltacht areas and communities, Conor and the Gaeilge, were highlighting the impact of Airbnb, but we see it in Dublin as well. But in particular, that they're not going to get covered. It's really bad. Like, it's not good policy, but maybe it's one of the areas that I think is going to, because they still have to progress the legislation. So I think there's going to be more on this.
I hope so, and we'll keep pushing, obviously, as well, and raising the message. Another thing that's going to be coming up soon is the issue of people with disabilities and the cost of living for them. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Well, yeah, and we were part of we put forward a motion in the Dáil on this specifically, and around looking for a cost of disability payment, and a very simple, payment once off. Or not, sorry, not a once-off, but a cost of disability payment, but targeted. And I think that's kind of one of the policies that we've promoted. And this would be a payment whereby it would effectively try and reverse the changes that the government made, where they cut payments effectively by...
We hear this phrase all the time, don't we? Heating and eating. Like the fact that people with disabilities have actually chosen this winter between heating and eating. Such is the cost of heating, and such is the cost of living with a disability.
Did you just say people with disabilities had to choose between heating and eating?
I did. Is that all? Is that controversial?
Now, when we raised that in the Dáil, the Social Protection Minister, Darragh Cleary, stated that he did not want, and I quote, a misleading and dangerous message to go out that people must choose between food and eating. So you are spreading a misleading and dangerous message.
It's actually like we're living in different places. Do you know that? I don't know where he's living, because it feels like we're living in different realities. We're hearing directly from people with disabilities about how hard life is. And we actually had the Irish Wheelchair Association and the Disability Federation of Ireland into the Infrastructure Committee yesterday, and they were kind of outlining how little consultation, meaningful consultation, actually happens with groups who represent people with disabilities around planning legislation, around procurement, to make sure that things in our world and in our society work for people with disabilities. They gave a really interesting example of, the return scheme for bottles and cans. Do you think disability inclusion had been considered when developing that procurement for those bottle bank schemes?
You would have assumed so, thought so.
Yeah, but a person in a wheelchair actually cannot reach up to put their can back in that.
So clearly not. And that's such a tangible example of, like, if you do not think about the needs of people with disabilities, what you get at the end of the product of the cycle is something that won't work for them. And that is such a systematic issue that we have, and we will have in the housing sector as well. Yeah, and I think that kind of one of the things that, like, I just think that statement was shocking, but actually it's like he said the quiet bit out loud, that, this claim, essentially that they are trying to gaslight people with disabilities, and the cost of living crisis is so hard. People are really struggling across the board, but particularly people with disabilities, because costs, like, they've charged mobility equipment, there's so many different costs, health costs, transport.
Getting a taxi, because you have to book so far in advance if you're trying to get the train on. You have to give such an advance notification if you're trying to get the train. And
again, the research, the evidence is there showing that extra cost. And I think, we were looking at that in terms of saying this payment, €400, it would go some way to help with that. Yeah. But Micheál Martin's response was, it's not fiscally sustainable. Like, fiscally sustainable, as the disability groups say, what's not fiscally sustainable or socially sustainable is leaving people having to choose between turning on the heat or eating. And then you think, of course, the wider health impacts of that and the cost to them, cost to society. It's just, and at the same time, they gave VAT cuts to fast food giants, to developers. It's not right.
Is that fiscally responsible?
Exactly.
Is it fiscally responsible to actually collect less in taxes, which they did with the last budget, we would obviously argue that it's not. And I think it's this whole idea of prioritization, what you prioritize, and the old age phrase, like joined up thinking, as you say. You know, giving some support to people now will mean that they might not be facing medical costs later down the line. And just to say, like, we have such big budget surpluses, so the idea that providing support to the most vulnerable in our society isn't fiscally responsible is just, it's really a really horrible, like it's an extreme point. It's actually quite an extreme point of view to hold.
It is,
you know?
Absolutely. And listen, another story, big story this week was, before we move on from that, I did want to mention there's a protest on the 28th of February in Dublin. If people can support that, we'll be there. That's important. I think that people get out and show their support and raise their voices, because I think there is a continued need to put pressure on the government over this. People shouldn't have to choose between heating and eating, and so we're supporting that protest on the 28th and the call for cost of disability payment and real action on cost of living. Absolutely. But we also saw internationally an Irish person detained by ICE.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a big story at the start of the week. Seamus Culloden, who's actually from Kilkenny originally, his sister lives in Kilkenny. He has been in an ICE detention centre for something like 5 months now. He was just scooped off the streets by ICE agents and has been held in really deplorable conditions, limited food, limited access to the outside, a cell with like 70 other men. And his family basically came out publicly because they weren't getting sufficient support from the government, and the case, Seamus's case wasn't getting moved along, so they felt obligated to kind of make this story public to try and get a movement and to get him released. And
also we saw that Shannon Airport has been used in terms of deportations.
Yeah, so last week
of ICE detainees, and
there was an article in the Guardian last week that said Shannon has been used by ICE to deport Palestinians from the US to the West Bank. And it's actually illegal under international law to deport people to an occupied territory. So, as a starting point, that's a human rights violation. And including the men were also shackled. They were reportedly actually shackled whilst on the plane. So I think the Irish government have a huge number of questions to answer with regards to those deportations. Like, Irish people are not interested in facilitating that.
Absolutely not. I think it is appalling, and a lot of people would be appalled to hear that Shannon Airport has been used in that way, in terms of that, and of course we know it's been used by the US military on an ongoing basis, and we've raised that and highlighted, and of course it was also raised the issue of Israel as well in terms of military weapons going through. And I think that a lot of people, I think the situation in terms of the Irishman who was detained by ICE kind of probably brought home to people how real that is, because we're watching it and seeing what happened in Minnesota, and the huge the awful actions by ICE, but then also the huge social movement in response, massive protests, Bruce Springsteen with his great song, and seeing that kind of different sides playing out, and some real despair, but then on the other side huge hope in those movements and protests, and then it being brought home so much with this.
Absolutely,
case.
And it can happen. I think the thing that happened with Seamus, like, it could happen to anyone with a loved one, any Irish person with a loved one in the US, will probably be very concerned about that. Seamus was married to he's married to a US citizen, so it really puts a lot of fear in people, I think.
It does, and it's interesting as well because it brings us on to our conference, which we had last weekend, which was an incredible event.
It was really good.
Yeah, really so positive, over 400 people, great energy, loads of young people, in particular, lots of different ages, different groups, real kind of, I think, kind of momentum, energy for real change and transformation for a social democratic Ireland, which was really, really positive. And it was one of the things we were chatting earlier about Holly's speech and how powerful it was. And so many people have actually been in touch with me and said they were really just impressed and inspired by it in terms of the vision it set out. But one of the things you want to talk about was her stance around immigration.
Yeah, I think I was so proud watching Holly speak so powerfully about the benefits of immigration and what people who've come to Ireland have done for our community and our society. People working in all different sectors, the care sector, the tech sector, doctors, and how much Ireland has benefited from that. And I think, we are living in toxic times around that whole debate. And I was really proud to watch Holly, without any fear, talk about that and lay out our position on that, and how, we are pro, we're a welcome society. We're pro being welcoming to people, and the kind of the rhetoric that we're hearing from the government, and quite frankly dog whistling to certain elements of society, that is just not who we are. It's not what what we're about. We believe in providing good, decent public services and having a society where there is a bottom floor under which no one can fall. And we don't have, we're not concerned that the people who are coming to Ireland to contribute to our society are some sort of threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I made it in my own speech in the housing meeting, and highlighted it, that point that they're using housing in particular around, Simon Harris, Micheál Martin, the scapegoating going on, the blaming of, population increase, immigration, even Harris, they really kind of, I described it as, it's just desperation, I think, on their part to actually go, we're going to now, he wrote about, homelessness and people who are homeless, and the amount of, the proportion of, as he referred to, people who aren't entitled to housing here, who are part of homelessness. And I was just thinking, I stood back and went, can you imagine talking about the most vulnerable people in this country who are in homelessness, and you're going to actually go after them and try and dissect who's who, where are they from, in order to deflect from your failures.
Yeah.
And I just think it's just so wrong. And it was great to see Holly, just call that out and provide a positive vision for what Ireland could be.
Yeah, it made me very proud. It made me very proud to be a member of the Social Democrats watching Holly's speech on Saturday.
The last thing we want to talk about was ghosts.
Tell me.
So it was reported in the weekend that there are ghosts in Leinster House. And the obvious ones you would think of would be the ghost of Charlie Haughey, obviously stalking the ground still, and the ghosts of, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael governments of the past, and spirits of corruption and all that entered the walls and are still seeping from the walls and influencing governments of today. But interestingly, it was reported that the ushers, who are the people who work here, who provide look after us, all the services, said that they hear children when the place is completely empty. They hear children, the laughter of children, the footsteps of children run up and down the halls inside Leinster House. And the history, of course, here is that one of the families that lived here, it was, of course, an estate house at the time, back in the 18th century, one of the women who lived had supposedly 20 children.
Wow, Jesus.
But I think only 15 survived. So that's the story, that there's ghosts in here.
Well, I've luckily never met them. I don't think I could handle that. I wouldn't come back to the office.
If you did, if we hear them or see them, we'll let you know. Absolutely. To all those, what do they call them, people who chase ghosts?
Ghost hunters.
Ghost hunters, that's it. Yeah. So along with politics, we'll have a bit of ghost hunting too.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, well, till next time.
Talk to you soon.